Well, open your Bibles up to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And we are working through this. We're not going to do a lot of review this time through because we're going to plow on as far as we can. We've gotten a little bit behind, but not terrible. And so I don't want to put any pressure on you. Like if you have something you want to bring up, feel free to bring that up. We still got time to camp out on something if we need to. But in chapter 8, Paul brings up this idea. He starts off and he says, now concerning things offered idol, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And I think that idea of knowledge puffing up, but love edifies is going to be a theme. Well, it's going to be a theme that comes up in other passages through in 1 Corinthians as well. But I think that theme's going to carry at least through chapter 10. Because in this idea of things that have been offered to idols, and I think he's talking about meat that has been offered to the pagan gods and then sold in the marketplace. What should a Christian do? Should a Christian eat that or not eat that? Because it's been offered to an idol. And so if it's been offered to an idol, maybe a Christian shouldn't have anything to do with it. And he says, we have knowledge. What knowledge should we have about that? There are no other gods. So the idol is nothing. It's protein. It's fine to eat. Unless what? It offends somebody else. Because everybody may not have that clear of an understanding. If you've grown up your whole life thinking this was consecrated to Zeus, and when I eat this, I'm honoring Zeus, then maybe that person's not in a place where they can eat of that just as protein. And so you need to be careful just because you understand that it's just protein, that you don't cause someone else to violate their conscience in that. So you may have the right knowledge, but if you're just puffed up with that knowledge, arrogant in that knowledge, and not loving towards your brother, then you're going to end up sinning against them in that. So that was kind of a lot of the thinking of chapter 8. Yeah, but isn't it my right? If there's nothing wrong with it, don't I have a right to eat it? Yeah, maybe you do have a right to eat it. Do you always have to exercise your rights? No. And the reason you wouldn't exercise your rights is because you love your brother and you care about him. And so we end in verse 13 with Paul saying, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. I'm willing to sacrifice, and you should be too. Well, Paul, are you really willing to sacrifice? And what's the answer? Yes, I am. And he's about in chapter 9 to go through and talk about some of the sacrifices he's made as an apostle. Any thoughts before we get into the new material?
I guess that would fall under service, would it not?
What do you mean?
Instead of, doing without it that offends somebody, it would fall under that title or umbrella of service.
Yes.
Serving one another, that would just be another way that we would be serving.
I think that's right. Yes.
Submitting to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Submitting to one another and serving one another. Very good.
I also you mentioned you sin against your brothers. It says you also sin against Christ in doing this. And so kind of understand the seriousness of it.
Very good.
He's going to pull on that idea a couple times, actually, about the things they're doing, how that affects the relationship with Christ. So in chapter 9, we open up with Paul asking a couple questions here. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? Why is he asking all these questions? Because as an apostle, we were just talking about the idea of rights. As an apostle, should he have some rights? Seems so. So you look down at verse 4 and verse 5. I know I'm skipping a little bit, but verse 4. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take a believing wife? Verse 6. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? And so you're looking at some of the things he's talking about here. He's talking about, are we supposed to be deprived of everything because just because we have a certain status? And the answer is what? No. In fact, they do have rights to certain things. They can take advantage of some things. So you look down and he kind of talks about the idea here of verse 9. Something written in the law of Moses. What's written in the law of Moses? Right, you should not muzzle an ox while he's treading out the grain. What's the idea behind that? Labor is worthy of his wages. He talks about that in different scenarios, right? A soldier, someone who plants a vineyard, someone who tends a flock. And then we get down to verse 10, the plowman, right? He plows in hope, and the thresher threshes in hope of sharing in the crop. And so what you see is that he's an apostle. He's done a lot of work. He has rights he can exercise. In verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things among you? So whenever a question like this is asked, what's the answer supposed to be? Is it too much? It's not too much, right? Who's giving the other something more valuable?
Paul's giving them something.
Yeah, Paul's giving them something more valuable, right? And, he's saying we could take some type of physical reward for that, or wages from that, maybe more accurately. And yet, do we see them exercise this? No, we don't see it. Verse 15. Is that where you're going? Okay, verse 15. I have made no use of any of these rights, even though in verse 14, the Lord commanded those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. I've not made use of these rights, nor am I writing to secure such a provision, right? So you might ask, why? Why is he not going to take advantage of these things? Why do you think?
Verse 18.
Yeah. He has the right. The Lord thinks it's okay. That's right. So there are some things obviously already going on here, right? Do you remember, back in chapter 1, what was the problem in chapter 1, the very beginning? Divisions, right? I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, right? Do you think this could have been something where it's like, well, hey, you know what Apollos didn't do that Paul did do? Like that could be something that sparks even more division, right? This could be something we saw in other letters. The idea that, I think the idea is that Paul was being attacked as far as being greedy, right? As far as wanting something for himself. He says, look, I'm trying to make sure that's not an issue. I don't want you to think this is all about myself or for myself. What is his reward in verse 18? So this is what you were asking.
Yeah, so in 18, he says, my reward is I'm preaching the gospel and I'm presenting the gospel without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. And basically, they are his reward in this. That the gospel is furthered is the reward that Paul is looking for. So he has a right. And as a matter of fact, he spends a lot of time talking about this right. And I think maybe it's because he had not exercised that right. What's the expectation? I've known of congregations where the preacher has been there for years and he's charged the congregation almost nothing at all for working there because he didn't want to be a burden. And he leaves and another preacher comes in and guess what the congregation does? We're going to pay you $75 a month. Come and work with us. I can't make it on $75. Why not? Brother so-and-so made it on $75 a month. I think what Paul is saying is since they had not experienced this, he's telling them, this is the way it should be. Even though I have not asked for this, this is the way it should be. You should be supporting those that are laboring with you. So I think he's dealing with that. But he's saying, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure the gospel is furthered no matter what. And if I have to give up my right to be supported in that, that's fine. Because I want the gospel to go forward. And he's saying all of this for the benefit of them, saying, and you should have the same spirit. You should be willing to give up eating a meat if that's what it takes in order to make sure that your brother doesn't stumble and fall. That service that you're offering. Paul's saying, I'm offering you this service for the sake of the gospel in that. And so you look at verse 19, and he says, though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. I want to win people to the Lord. I want them to be faithful to the Lord. So I'm willing to give up my rights if it benefits them in that cause. So he's using himself as an example here, but I also think he's teaching them a lesson that maybe they haven't had an opportunity to learn by experience yet.
So you talked about verse 19. You stopped there?
I did stop there.
So in 20 through 23, let's say, in 20 through 23, he kind of goes through a list of things. He talks about, I became like a Jew. You look at the end of verse 20, that I might win those under the law. Verse 21, I became like those outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. Verse 22, to the weak I became weak, that by all means I might, and I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. So what is everything he's doing directed towards? The benefit of others and the benefit of Christ in the kingdom, right? It's not about himself. And what have we seen pretty much all throughout the letter? The main problem the Corinthians have. Selfishness, right? I'm following the right preacher. I'm living the way I want to. We're proud of the things that we're doing. It's been all about selfishness, all about the way they want to live the whole time. He's saying, this is not the way things ought to be. View me as an example. And in fact, he'll go a little bit further with the idea of viewing me as an example. I missed that. What was it? Yes, a soul is more important than you have the right to do something. That's exactly right.
Any thoughts? You finished?
I didn't finish the chapter. I was going to.
Well,
yeah, you ahead.
Let's stop at verse 23 here. Any thoughts or comments through verse 23 that you want to add to this? All right, you see the flow of thought so far. Now, what was the topic that he started off with? Yeah, concerning things that are offered to idols. And what do they know? The idol is nothing, and so the meat's fine to eat, right? So that he started off with that idea. Well, what does knowledge do according to Paul? It puffs up, makes one arrogant. All right? Love is the solution to that. So he dealt with the love issue. If you love your brother, then you won't do anything that would push them. But now he comes back to this idea of knowledge puffing up, I believe. What happens when you're arrogant? What comes before a fall? Pride comes before a fall. All right, well, if they've got this knowledge, well, idols are nothing. We can eat of that meat. That's no problem. I think what Paul does here is he reins that in. He says, you still need to be careful. You're surrounded by idolatry on all sides. And you may recognize, oh, these gods are not nothing. But you better be careful how you jump in to participate. Because has there ever been anybody else in the past who's had knowledge and known what is right and yet ended up falling? Yeah, a lot. So let's look at what Paul gives as an example here. So he starts off in verse 24 of talking about how do athletes participate in something? Half-heartedly? By the way, most of you know, if you've ever seen a great athlete who may get to a certain point, and when he becomes pretty confident, actually very confident of his skills and abilities, he starts to get where I don't have to practice. I'm good enough. I don't have to practice, and I can still beat these guys. And what begins to happen to his performance? He starts to get beat. All right, so watch this. Verse 24. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable. Therefore, thus I run, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should be disqualified. Who is Paul? An apostle. And does it sound like that he is careful in that he doesn't become overconfident, but that he continues to pursue and make sure and discipline himself to make sure that he's doing what he's supposed to be doing? Because someone can become overconfident. So he starts off with himself as an example and kind of setting the tone for this is how you need to be living your life. You don't need to get where you are so confident in your knowledge of things that you back off. You need to keep pursuing this because we are pursuing an imperishable crown that requires all effort and all diligence. Run in such a way that you may obtain it.
I might just mention here, I think he talks about both sides of this. You do this. I'm also doing this because of verse 23, right? In verse 23, I do all for the sake of the gospel that I may share with them in its blessings. And I think that's what he's trying to show there is you need to be running in order to get these blessings. And I'm trying to do that too. I want to share in this with you.
So who does he use as an example of kind of the ultimate example of someone that had knowledge and yet failed?
Didn't finish the race.
Didn't finish the race. Himself? Israelites. That's what I was looking for. The Israelites became the ultimate example. Look at all of the blessings that they had. So he starts off in verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all of our fathers, the Israelites, were under the cloud. You remember how God led them out with a pillar of cloud. And God's presence was right there leading them. All passed through the sea. Do you remember how they were able to go on the dry land in the Red Sea and be delivered from the Egyptians on that? All were baptized into Moses. Well, wait a minute. Now he's starting to use language that sounds more Christian than Israelites. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. They had all of these spiritual blessings. But, verse 5, what? God wasn't pleased with them. What happened to most of them? Nearly all of them. They died in the wilderness. They did not finish the race. They did not get the prize. And the reason is because, well, they got caught up in things that they knew better than to do. It wasn't that they didn't know. They had knowledge. But they were overconfident in that knowledge, and it led to their downfall and their destruction.
Yeah, in verse 6, I think we talked about this quite a bit, but I think it's great. Now, these things took place as an example for us that we should not what? Mine says desire evil as they did. Yeah. Lust after evil. That's right. Now, what are some of the things he might have been talking about that, the Corinthians in particular would have been desiring that are evil? Maybe verse 7 and verse 8 might give you an idea. Sexual morality, verse 8. What does yours say in verse 7? Don't be idolaters, right? We just talked about those things, right? Don't be idolaters. Don't be sexually immoral. They participated in those things. And some of them, in verse 8, I say some of them, 23,000 fell in a single day. So you see, God was not accepting of this. They, in verse 9, put the Lord to the test, and did it work out well for them? No. So what should you be learning from this? What's the lesson? You don't do it, right? Yeah, you don't do it. So if you're able to look back and you're able to see, this is how the Israelites participated in these things, and this is how God reacted to it, you should learn something from that, right? You shouldn't go into it. You're talking about being arrogant and saying, well, I'm sure things will be different now. No. God's going to be the same way. And so, again, verse 11, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. So verse 12, this is where we get what we've been referencing. Anyone who thinks that he stands, take heed lest he fall. So be careful, okay? Be careful. Now, sometimes, is it okay if I keep going with this, or do you want to say? No. Sometimes we have desires that are really strong, right? Well, then obviously we can't resist. Is that how it works? No. Verse 13, what does it say? Yes.
You can't be overtaken by temptation.
No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. You will be able to endure it, right? So what I think this is what they need to hear is they might be looking and say, well, look, we have this evil all around us. We have idolatry all around us. We have sexual immorality all around us. And these are things that, we read about already. These are things they came out of. So obviously they've been participating in this. This obviously has an appeal to them. Well, how am I supposed to resist that? You can resist it because God is with you. So don't test God, resist it. Go with God. And notice what it says in verse 14. How should they react to this? They should flee from it, right? You run away from it. Get away from it as much as you can. So don't just, again, we have the idea of arrogance. Sometimes we just sit there and like, well, I can be this close to it and it's fine. No, you get far away from it. Don't test God. Don't test yourself either, right?
Yeah, I think that's the main idea is, here you have this knowledge that the idol is nothing and that this is just meat, this is just protein, you can eat it. At the same time, don't let that cause you to get too close to idolatry where you get sucked into it. And you think, I would never have a problem with that. Really? Because Israel had a lot of blessings. They had God's presence right before them, and they got sucked into those type of things. It still baffles us to think about they're at the bottom of a smoking mountain where they can see the glow of God's presence on the mountain, and they build a calf, a golden calf, violating the first and second commandment that they just vowed to. That's hard to imagine that they could follow that. This idea of coming back in verse 13 and assuring them that they can overcome this, when you use Israel as an example and say, hey, they're our example that we don't do the same thing. And then you start thinking, wait, about 1.5 million of them came out of Egypt. How many of them ended up going to the promised land out of that original number? 2. Well, then what chance do I have? I don't know that I can do better than them. And what verse 13 says is, yes, you can. You can. You can resist temptation. And you need to know there's a real danger there. But you also need to know that you can, with God's help, overcome those temptations and be faithful to the Lord. You will make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. So I think that's a very important balance to hold in our mind, is that I am not immune from temptation. I am vulnerable to temptation. So I need to rely heavily upon the Lord to help me to find a way of escape. And I think if we go through life that way with a very healthy caution and reliance upon God, that we will not make the same mistakes that Israel made. Does that make sense?
So then he draws a pretty hard line about idolatry. So if you're looking at 16 through 22, is it possible to partake in idolatry and serve the Lord? It's not possible. Verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Can't do it. It's not possible. You're either doing one or the other.
But wait a minute. I thought the idol wasn't anything. So if the idol is nothing, then can I go to the idol's temple and feast with them? I mean, it's just protein, right? It's just protein in the marketplace. Surely it's just protein in the idol's temple as well. What's the difference? Yeah. Let me ask you this. On Sunday morning, there are crackers and grape juice placed upon this table. It's just crackers and grape juice, right? Is it just crackers and grape juice when it's on this table? And we are saying this is the body of the Lord. This is the blood of the Lord. No, it has a great. You may take those same crackers and eat them at home in your living room, and it'd be just crackers. And you may pour a glass of grape juice in your kitchen, and it's just grape juice. But in this setting, it's not. You may buy meat in the marketplace, and it's just a cow that someone slaughtered somewhere. But when you go to the temple of Zeus and you eat it there, it's different. Can you see that? And I think that's what he's saying. So if someone says, I have knowledge, I can just partake of this and it's no problem. Oh, it is if there's a direct connection there, if there's a direct association there, then you're participating in that. You're participating in idol worship, not just eating protein.
And he specifically, after that, comes back to the idea about your brother. So you look at verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. And so when you get into verse 28, if you're able to recognize this is where the meat came from, this has been offered in sacrifice, what's your response in verse 28? You don't eat it, right? Okay, yeah, you don't eat it. All right, now you don't eat it for your conscience, right? For their conscience, right? You might know it's nothing, but they don't. So you're going to, it would be wrong. It would be a sin against your brother, against your neighbor, or against Christ to take that in such a way where they think you're having communion with Christ and with, it used the word demons earlier. And so, verse 31, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Do all to the glory of God. And that's to the brother, that's to the outsider. Do all to the glory of God. So give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they might be saved. And then verse 11, I think, is paired with this actually, still the same idea. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. So I think that gives us an explanation for why we went into what we went into in chapter 9. He's trying to show, this is the attitude I'm trying to take. You need to take the same kind of attitude. You need to take the attitude that I have, but I only have it because Christ has it. And so again, I think he's trying to point everything back to Christ.
So we want to gain as much knowledge as we can. We want to understand the way things really are about every issue that we possibly can. But we want to use that knowledge in such a way that it doesn't make us arrogant and reckless in the way that we live. And we want to use that knowledge in a way that is beneficial to our fellow man as well. And so knowledge by itself just puffs up and makes arrogant and makes us vulnerable to temptation. Knowledge with love makes us useful for the kingdom. Anything else through chapter 10? All right, chapter 11. In chapter 11, we have some thoughts about some things that are going on that are disorderly in a number of ways. And he starts off in this chapter in verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions as I deliver them to you. In other words, the things that I have delivered to you that you're doing, I praise you in that. But, so there seems to be a contrast here. There seems to be some things that he's delivered to them that they are not practicing as they should. And so he reminds them and he says, but I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And then he's going to spend the next verses 4 through 16, going through and talking about something that there's a lot of different views on, a lot of confusion about. But it has to do with this order of man and woman and how that order is signified, how it is recognized. And so he talks about the fact that when a man prays or prophesies, how should he be adorned? All right, no covering on his head. When a woman prays or prophesies, how should she be adorned? The cover. All right, why was that the case?
Has to do with authority.
It has to do with authority. And the way that someone was adorned recognized something about those distinction and roles. I'm going to make this as because I know we have different thoughts about this, and so I'm going to make it as general to get the general point as possible. And we may be able to discuss some of the specifics as well. But the general point is there is a headship of man over woman. You see that in verse 3. I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And then he goes through and he talks about, so how are those role distinctions recognized among the Corinthians? And it was a distinction in the way that they were dressed in that. And if someone were to throw off that distinction, it was signifying they were throwing off that role that God had given them. And so he deals with that. So the problem, I believe, based upon what he's saying here, was more than just whether or not somebody was wearing a particular article of clothing or not. It was that wearing of that particular article of clothing was showing what they recognized about the role that God had given them. And apparently the Corinthians were stumbling in this fact.
So I might have interpreted verse 2 a little bit differently than you. So whenever it says, I commend you because you remember me and everything and maintain the traditions, even as to deliver them to you. And then verse 3 says, but I want you to understand. I was thinking that probably, or at least this is the way it sounded to me, that they are like practicing this, at least for the most part, but he wants them to understand why they're doing it. There seem to be questions about like, is this necessary? Is this something we need to do or not? And he's like, yes, and here's why. That's kind of how I was
I think that's a possibility. I think it's a possibility. The but may not be as, showing the contrast as much as maybe I emphasize there. Thoughts about this? Because there's a lot of questions. He brings up a lot of different things here. What are some of the things that he brings up besides just a head covering or not a head covering? What else does he bring up? Yes, long hair, short hair. All right, he brings up that. brings up a woman's hair being her glory or covering, given to her for a covering. All of those things were certainly in their mind something that had to do with the different ways that men and women dress or adorn themselves. And they were particular with the roles of men and women. Do we have similar things that distinguish men and women today?
Why don't you tell us?
Can you tell when a man is trying to dress like a woman? So there's something that something you look at and say, now that's not right. That doesn't, something's not right about that. And I think that that's the case, and vice versa. We can still see that. I think that, what does that tell you? When a man is intentionally wearing articles of clothing for a woman, what does that tell you about that man? I know we don't know everything, but what is that? What comes to your mind? All right. I'm not sure he appreciates the role that God has given him. I'm not sure he appreciates his masculinity. And I think that's what's under consideration here, is that you have men who are supposed to be the head of the woman, and yet they're casting off their masculinity, and you have women that are casting off their femininity. And those roles are not being honored the way that God said they should be honored. And so he brings them back to that. Other thoughts you got? Anybody have? Verse 16? No.
We didn't read it.
But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. There's some question over what's the contention over. Is he saying now if you have differences on this, you differ with me on this, well then we don't have any custom about being contentious about things, or we don't have the custom of arguing about that. I don't think that what he's saying here, he just went through and made a very strong case, a very strong argument. I don't think he's going back and saying, but it doesn't really matter. If you believe something different, it doesn't matter. I do think what he's saying is we are not in the position of arguing against what God has revealed. Does that make sense? Is that the way you understand that? How do you understand verse 16?
Yeah, I think the idea is that we're not going to argue about it because that's not how Christians ought to act.
Okay.
That's how I take it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
Paul, when he was in Corinth before, he'd taken a vow, and I don't know how long it was, he went down to see Creta, had it shaved off, so I don't know if, I mean, I guess that these are different things, but it just seems he would have had long hair at some point.
Right.
Where he had to cut off for that vow, so I don't know how long.
Yes, so we have a lot of things that come up. We're not going to get into them all tonight because there's no way we could move on with the material like we need to. But you have several things that make this passage challenging. You have him talking about men having long hair. It's a shame to him. Anybody in the Old Testament you ever knew that had long hair? Who told him to have long hair? God did. All right, God did. All right, so anybody in the Old Testament any man in the Old Testament you ever knew that prayed or prophesied with his head covered? You have to put some things together on this one, but what were the priests to wear? They were to wear a turban, and they were in a position of praying and prophesying for the people. The point that I'm making is if you try to fit what Paul is saying here with everything else in the scripture, you're going to find some challenges. You're going to find some difficulties there. And so we're trying to sort through and figure out what is it that Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to understand. And we can sit down and have that discussion on those. But here's what I want to say. What he's trying to get the Corinthians to understand is verse 3. Everything else that he's dealing with here is in support of verse 3. So I may not understand exactly what he has in mind. For instance, I have not talked to anybody that has been able to give me an answer that I felt made much sense about, for this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. I'm not sure what he's talking about there. But I know the main point that he's making because he stated it in verse 3. And so I don't know that I know all the specifics of what he's dealing with. By the way, remember, whose mail is this? Corinthians. They had asked questions. We don't know what those questions are. He had already told them things. We don't know what he told them in the past. So we're having to look at this and try to understand what's going on. The Holy Spirit did reveal enough here that I think we can leave this chapter with saying, all right, I understand this. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And however we live, however we dress, however we interact with each other needs to reflect that truth. And so I feel comfortable there. There's other things that I'm like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that.
So I wrote down a reference at some point, Jude 1:6, about the, because of the angels.
Okay.
And it makes sense because you're talking about the position.
Right.
Right at Jude 1:6.
Yeah. So for y'all that can't hear, Alicia's saying that she referenced Jude 1:6, which talks about the angels who left their proper domain and they were punished. And that's the best argument that I've heard. And I tend to think that maybe what's under consideration there as well. So when the angels no longer respected the role that God gave them, what happened? They were cast out. So we don't want to be disrespectful to the role that God has given us as men and women and be rejected by God as well. So maybe that is what's under consideration. Yes, sir.
I don't want to take up any more time. If you consider the situation that they're in, this is really idolatry that he's leading from. That's where this is coming from. And in the city, in the Corinthian city, Diana was one of the major symbols of the goddess, in worship, and was connected with that prostitution where they shaved their heads. And the authority, the look was the woman was shorn, so she associated with the temple of Diana, and then they came down to the fact that he's trying to get them to see who the authority really is. It's not Diana, it's God.
Right.
And man is under that. And that seems to be where this may be coming from. I don't know that.
Yeah.
It's just that is a possibility.
There's definitely factors that I think we can conclude they were aware of that were specific to them, that made sense to them, that may not make as much sense to us. And but I do think that coming back, and as you said, I think we can know what the conclusion is, what he's trying to get across. And so,
Because he was trying to get them to see that idolatry was a terrible, very serious thing. And you don't want to be associated with it in any way.
that's right. Very good. All right. Now the rest of the chapter. In giving these instructions, I do not praise you. So he said that earlier, I praise you in verse 2. Now he says, now I'm not going to praise you here, because what happens when you come together? It's for the worse. What's going on? What are they supposed to be coming together for? Take the Lord's Supper, what we came together for this morning. What should be involved in partaking of the Lord's Supper? Think back to chapter 10. Symbolizes Christ. Notice what he says there. He says, the bread that we partake of is communion with the body of Christ, and is not the cup of the blessing which we bless, not communion with the blood of Christ, and the bread which we break is not communion with the body of Christ. For we being many are what? One bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. They're coming together to partake of that one bread in fellowship and communion with one another in the body of Christ. And what do? Y'all know this passage. We're not going to read the whole chapter, so just... All right, they're divided. Divided in ways, they're eating at different times. They're eating different amounts. There's no regard for anybody else in this. They are making it, I've heard people say, well, they're making it like a potluck. No, it wasn't like a potluck because they weren't sharing. There was none of that going on. They were very self-focused in all of this. And he's saying, that's an utter disgrace to what you're being called together to do. When Christ instructed you to partake this, how did he instruct? What did he instruct? Just tell me in your own words. This is my body, which is done, was broken for you. For what purpose? What are you supposed to do? Remember him. Remember him. Is that what they're doing? No, that's not what they're doing. So he goes through, and I like this chapter because I think it's a good pattern for us. When there's just a mess of confusion and a mess with people, what he does is he goes, let's just get back to the very basics. What was it that was instructed? Let's practice that. And so when he finishes, he says, if anyone's hungry, what do you need to do? Eat at home. This is not the place for satisfying hunger. This is the place to come together to remember Christ and to remember our covenant with him and our association with one another because of him. And so let that be the focus of when you come together. And you need to examine yourself and you need to make sure that's what you're doing, because if you're not doing that, you're eating and drinking condemnation to yourself and not discerning the Lord's body.
The ultimate reason for not having divisions.
Yes. Right. Christ is the ultimate reason for not having divisions. Very good.
In verse 22, the latter part is he's saying, you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing. Like, were they partaking of the Lord's Supper, not even believing for everyone to be able to partake?
Yeah, this was supposed to be the Lord's Supper, but if you notice what he starts off, he said, when you come together, I hear, excuse me, let me back up here.
20,
yes. When you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, because they weren't even making the Lord's Supper out of it. What they were doing is they were bringing food, from what I understand, and just eating it themselves, maybe them and their family, with no regard to anybody else. And so there was some that were getting drunk and others that had absolutely nothing. That was not what the Lord was instructing.
So I might mention this. We've been talking about how one of the issues they have, and I think it pops up here, is that they are selfish. That they're only thinking about themselves. But there are times to think about yourself. So we talked about examine yourself, all right? Paul talks about, back when we were in chapter 9, he talks about, I'm disciplining my body, keeping control lest after preaching others, I should be disqualified. He's thinking about himself there, but how ought we to think about ourselves? In what type of way? In a spiritual way, right? We ought to be thinking about those kind of things. Instead, that's not what's going on here. What they're thinking about is they're thinking about themselves in a fleshly way. And that's why I think before, when he talks about, I can't talk to you like spiritual people, I have to talk to you as fleshly people, as, babes in Christ, is because this is how they were thinking about everything. They're thinking about themselves, but in a fleshly way. He's saying, you can think about yourself, but it has to be a spiritual way. You have to think about others. Everything has to be in a spiritual light. And they're just not doing that.
Well, surely if they were thinking about spiritual gifts, they would be thinking about it in a spiritual way, right? No.
Yeah.
And so we're not going to get into chapters 12 through 14, but I do want you to think of, we may get into it a little bit, but I want you to think of that as a block of material. 12, 13, and 14. You notice how he starts off in verse 1 of chapter 12? But concerning spiritual gifts, I do not want you to be ignorant. So he's going to talk to them now about spiritual gifts. So what are spiritual gifts? Somebody define that for me.
Special gift that the apostles had, and they could pass it on others to show that they were sent from God when they were preaching the gospel.
Yes. Very good. Can you give me an example of it?
Like speaking in tongues.
Speaking in tongues. Healing the sick. Raising the dead. Prophesying. Miraculous knowledge. Those type of things. Now, Paul, when he was in Corinth, he was able to lay his hands on people and give them that ability. Wouldn't it be cool if I could go over to Abe and I could put my hand on his forehead and suddenly Abe could speak fluent Spanish for us? Abe, how would you feel? You know Spanish? You don't know Spanish? A little bit. But wouldn't it be cool within seconds if you knew fluently? You knew it. Would you be proud of that? That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Well, what if I've got a spiritual gift, but Mine's not really that noticeable. Nobody even knows I have it. It's hard for me to show mine off, but Abe, I mean, he can just bust out singing in Spanish, and it sounds really cool. What's happening is these very spiritually immature, carnally minded Christians have received these spiritual gifts, and they have totally lost sight of what the purpose was for. And so they're excited about it. They're going around speaking in tongues. They want everybody to know they can speak in tongues, but they're not using it for the purpose. And so he's going to go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so real quick, what do you think the purpose of it is based on some of the things we've been talking about recently? That's right, to edify others, to the benefit of others, maybe the whole group, if we're talking about a church, but to the benefit of others.
So what we'll do next time, Lord willing, is we'll kind of blast through chapters 12, 13, and 14, putting those together. And so read those carefully before next time, and go ahead and finish up 1 Corinthians, because we will finish up 1 Corinthians next time. Yes, we will. And so get a good idea of what the flow of thought is there, and then we're just going to very quickly go through and show the major argumentation that Paul has going on there. Thank you for your good attention and comments. Appreciate that very much. And we will pick up there next time, and we'll go ahead and be prepared to get through 16. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.